Taoiseach, you're welcome to the House, and thank you for bringing this bill for our consideration. Taoiseach, the new section that we seek to implement, the new Section 6, is about, if you want, the separation of powers between the Department and the Defence Forces per se. There have long been allegations and suggestions that there is a toxic relationship between the uniformed and non-uniformed personnel. But if we look at the Garda Síochána, the Commissioner of the Gardaí is the accounting officer for the Garda Síochána, and as such has the administrative rights over his organisation. I think the amendment we're putting forward here is to restructure the command of the Defence Forces. And I know yourself brought to Cabinet yesterday a change to the structures of the Defence Forces, which will be extremely welcome. But I do believe that the Chief of Staff needs to be autonomous in the role, whoever he or she may be, and that person would have at their disposal the accounting function within the organisation, and as such would be able to act immediately. We've seen in recent times decisions, ridiculous decisions. What used to be a battalion commander's decision back in my day in the Defence Forces now has to go to the department for sanction. The loan of a tent for a local community, stuff like that. With the Defence Forces autonomous, I think this particular amendment would give the Defence Forces that degree of autonomy that they would be able to operate without constantly going back to the department. So I would ask you to consider this amendment seriously. Thank you.
Well, I thank Deputies Craughwell and Wall for their contributions. This was discussed in the other House with Deputy Howland tabled similar motion or amendment into Dáil, and I indicated to him that I had instructed my officials to examine the chain of command and the entire 1954 Act insofar as it relates to proper structures. The Commissioner of the Defence Forces recommended a Chief of the Defence Forces, recommended a joint services approach, upgrading the Chief of Air Corps, Navy and Army, and having all at a similar level, and then having a Vice Chad also. And in essence, yesterday in the Cabinet, we brought forward, I sought permission to draft heads of bills, brought forward the heads of bills and sought permission to draft a bill. There's obviously, I think the 1954 Act is simply not fit for purpose. I don't accept the arguments that it's not more about sort of departments overreach or getting into operational issues. It's far more fundamental and profound than that. The Chief of Staff under the 54 Act actually, as might be perceived by the layperson, isn't actually a Chief of Staff that can direct, for example, the flag officer or direct the brigade commanders under the Act. That's clear. However, he has delegated management functions from the department, and it has worked over the decades, but in no way could it be seen as optimal. And the Defence Commission, the Commission of the Defence Forces, were very clear, having looked at Western democracies and how they were structured, that we would develop a similar CHOD structure with a Chief of the Defence Forces. Now, there are important issues, and I note Senator Craughwell uses the word autonomous. I think in the context of a democracy, no defence force can be autonomous in that sense. Fundamentally, the primacy of the civilian authority must always be a key factor in any such defence legislation. What I would ask the senators is, we've now published essentially the heads. We're going to draft legislation. It is comprehensive. To try and stitch it into this bill is inappropriate. I think if you're saying you want pre-leg and all the rest of it, that hasn't happened here. So the idea, the progress will be the drafting of a bill, pre-legislative scrutiny, then a committee, and the normal stages of the bill. And my view is that we should await the publication of the bill itself, the substantive bill on this issue.
Minister. Thank you. I accept what you're saying, Taoiseach, but the point I'm making about the overreaching arch of the department. Defence Forces communities, Athlone, Galway, Cork, etc., Generally speaking, the officer commanding the unit back in the day when I was there, if the local community wanted assistance, we used to have firing parties, for example, for old IRA people. The request went into the commanding officer, it was sanctioned locally and it was dealt with locally. Now everything has to go back to the department. And I've had situations, for example, for the commemoration of the fallen of the First World War in Galway. 12th hour, thanks to the Secretary General of the department, at the 12th hour, a couple of hours before it was due to take place a few years ago, we got sanctioned to run it. We have to, when I talk about autonomy, I'm talking about autonomy about within the Defence Forces itself. Of course, I accept that the Chief of Staff and all of the members of the Defence Forces are answerable to the Minister, and that will always be the way, and should always be the way. But there has to be local control. You cannot have a situation where, in some cases, junior officials in the department have the right of sanction on a particular request, whereas a lieutenant colonel in charge of 500 or 600 men and women cannot make that decision, and that's fundamentally wrong, and I think you'll agree with that yourself. We have always been embedded in the communities that we serve within, and I would hate to see that being eroded further. And I think, I know what the Commission recommended regarding the breakdown of the structures, and I agree with my colleague Senator McDougall. I'd like to see the writing on the wall on that one before we start to give it sanction, but it's a good idea that the Army, the Air Corps or Air Force as it will become, and the Navy will have their own structures, and that's an important thing. But I'm down here at the sort of lending out a tent for a weekend fair in the local community. Surely to God, local colonels should do that.
Come on, Minister. Anyone else? No, Minister? You happy?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I thought you were somebody else for calling.
Sorry, Taoiseach, sorry.
Just to say, Deputy Senator McDowell, I mean, you have experience of how government works, and essentially, there is no secrecy about this at all. This was in the Commission of the Defence Forces, in broad brush terms, in terms of the idea of amending the 54 Act, a completely new chain of command, but particularly a CHAD, Chief of the Defence Forces. And then you'd have, and we've no issue with summarising this, but in terms of what's in the heads. But then the next stage then is we do have to draft it, and then we have to engage on the basis of the draft bill, which is normal and makes sense. The issues will be around the accountability chain, around some of the issues that you raised in terms of who ultimately is the accounting officer, what are the demarcation lines, how do you have the chain of command right to Minister of Defence, government, sec chain, all of that. They're the areas of, sort of, I presume will be some areas of debate around those areas. But the fundamental structure is going to happen as per the Commission on the Defence Forces, because the existing structures are not adequate at all, in my view. And in terms of, we would love more delegated authority, Senator Craughwell, really would. And there's a hell of a lot of delegation that's taken place already in terms of regulations and so on, like that, as you know. So we would love more delegated authority. Thank you. So about the fundamental point, though, this bill isn't suitable for this amendment. I accept your right to raise it, but to insert this into this bill, given that we're doing an overhaul, a comprehensive overhaul of the 54 Act involving chain of command. That's my argument, really.
Senator McDougall.
What the senators are saying, they want us to move away from where we are now. That's the direction of travel. There will be debate around the detail of it.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, we find ourselves in a situation where you're promising legislation coming down the line that's going to fix all these things. And I believe you're correct in what you're saying, but you may not be in power long enough to bring that legislation. Legislation takes a long time to draft. And who knows, you guys might come back in September and decide you're heading to the high road. And where will the legislation be then? This amendment that we've been talking about, it puts in place a command structure through this bill. I would ask you, Minister, how often do you meet the Chief of Staff on a one-to-one basis, just you and him, for defence briefings? Because having a command structure is also about briefing the civilian side, and that is you. So how often do you meet the Chief of Staff for those briefings? Sorry?
In your amendment?
Yeah, it's on my amendment. We're talking about a command structure.
No, not in relation to the Minister. Minister.
Interesting question, which plays to this kind of agenda of almost, I mean, the hostility to the department that comes across in some of your presentations worries me at times. It does genuinely.
Your acceptance of the department worries me.
No, I think it's like the department is a government department that represents the civilian wing of government. I've met the Chief of Staff separately on occasions, but I think the Chief of Staff would be the first to say as well that you need a collaborative approach in real time, in reality, in practice, de facto. So, I mean, the idea that you kind of write out the Secretary General, whoever the Secretary General may be at any time, not clear on the sort of rationale behind that all of the time. If you accept the primacy of the civilian authority.
The rationale is very clear, Taoiseach. The rationale is very simple. The Defence Chief of Staff has a defence focus, is an expert in the area of defence. The Secretary-General is an administrative person who does not have a defence background. And we are living in very dangerous times. And I resent the fact that you say I'm hostile to the department. I'm anything but hostile to the department.
I get a sense of it.
I personally believe the department has a job to do, and I'm 100% supportive of the job they have to do. But I am also deeply concerned that defence in some way is being pushed aside and is being pushed into a corner. The events over the last couple of weeks demonised the defence. And I have to say I was deeply disappointed in your own statements where you said defence had to be held, members of the defence forces had to be held at a higher standard than the rest of society. How can you say that? We're drawn from society. Members of the Defence Forces are members of our society. We were talking about 26 people mentioned in the Independent Review Group report, which demonised and damned the Defence Forces to hell, has now proved to be a puff of smoke. There was nothing in it. They've gone on now to look at the next 10 cases. 26 cases. The Commissioner of the Gardaí said there is nothing to be answered here. They've been investigated, nothing to be seen. There are now going into less than 10 historical cases. This House and the lower house has done extreme damage to the Defence Forces. And statements like holding them at a higher plane than anybody else.
Senator, we have to stick to the amendment on the command structure.
Well, it's on the command structure. That's what we're talking about.
You're on more generally about the defence.
Well, no, I mean, if it's my view that I'm talking about the command structure and the way in which the Defence Forces is held, I'm entitled to that view.
No, you're not. It's the Chair's view as whether or not it's in line with the amendment, not your view.
You might be just being a little hard on me.
Otherwise, we'd never finish. Are you pressing the amendment?
Of course I'm pressing the amendment.
The question is the amendment be made.
Thank you. Taoiseach, what we're talking about here is we're talking about gagging members of the Defence Forces. We don't have any difficulty on the political side, but government policy is really the issue, as Senator McDougall has outlined there. There's already been a High Court case in relation to a soldier who wanted to appear in the Respect and Loyalty parades that took place here in 2021, 2019, 2020. And your department has already lost that case on constitutional grounds. This is the right of a soldier to protest in a public parade. Now, we're talking about double standards here because during the last Chief of Staff's reign of office or term of office, soldiers were encouraged in uniform to parade in what was a political parade, and that was the Pride Parade every year. Pride is a political movement, whether we like it or not, and soldiers were encouraged not just to parade in uniform, but to wear Pride flags, etc., etc. I've no difficulty with it whatsoever. I think it's a perfect role for the Defence Forces to do, to show diversity within our country. But you can't have it both ways. You can't have a situation where right now there are members of the Defence Forces all over the country hurting over comments being made and they know they cannot respond. and they won't respond, because that's the discipline that we've been brought into the organisation with and understood from the very outset. When you join as a recruit, you're limited in what you can and can't say. But what we've got to be very careful about here is the two representative bodies and the veterans representative bodies of ONE, ARCO and IONVA. Those bodies need to be free to speak their minds. Now, there's nothing stopping the veterans, but RACO and PD4 will be limited in what they're saying. Indeed, it's remarkable at the moment that they're managing to hold their tongues with what's going on in the country at the moment. I don't see the need to bring in this. Can anybody in your department point at a time when soldiers at some stage started to comment on things about government policy? Can anybody show me that there's evidence of that? I don't believe it has ever happened. I believe that this gagging order is completely unnecessary, and I believe that what you need to do is you need to put it away and put an end to it. We don't need it. You can rest assured both RACO and PD4 will always play within the rules, will always work within the rules, and my experience of them is that they are decent, honourable people who will always try to do the right thing by your department and by their own membership. I don't see the need for this, and I really do believe we need to have it taken out.
First of all, and I thank the senators for the amendments to sections 11 and 24. Just make the fundamental point that section 11(1)(a), a member of the Defence Forces shall not, while in uniform or otherwise make himself or herself identifiable as a member of the Permanent Defence Force. So if a soldier turns up, a representative or the member of the Defence Forces turns up at the school as a parent, doesn't make themselves say, I happen to be a member. There's nothing stopping that parent from saying, I think we need the school extension or whatever in terms of the implementation. There's nothing in the bill that stops that. I think that's very important. While in uniform or otherwise making himself or herself identifiable as a member of the Permanent Defence Forces. And we discussed this at length in the Dáil, and I understand as well, I do genuinely understand the concerns that the members have, but I want to repeatedly, and I've stated this, nothing in this bill will interfere with the statutory purpose of the military representative associations to represent their members. So, for example, you take housing for members of the Defence Force. It's quite legitimate for PD4 or RACO to advocate on behalf of their members for housing. Indeed, I have responded quite positively in terms of new accommodation blocks in Hallbowlen, in various barracks around the country. We just opened a new block in Collins Barracks, and there was good work done in McKee Barracks as well. And that's going to continue. I mean, in fact, there will be a master plan for every installation now, a proper comprehensive master plan in terms of physical development. Paragraph G of the proposed new Section 2A of the Defence Amendment Act clearly provides that the provisions on the making of public statements or comments are without, quote, without prejudice to the purpose of an association of representing members. So I'm very, very clear about that. This is no gagging order. Like, representative associations can speak on any matter that relates to their members and advocacy for their members. The overall provisions are fundamentally about the importance of an apolitical defence force. And I think we've been well served. I take your point. We've been well served since the foundation of the state of having an apolitical defence force. It's very important. It protects the members themselves as well, I would argue. You know, everyone knows the rules when they join. What we're doing here is providing clarity in primary legislation to that effect. And these provisions are not new. That's the other point. These are not new provisions in the sense that the Defence Act of 1954 and the oaths that are taken by Defence Force members have always provided for restrictions with regard to political activities. So the legislation is not seeking, just to be clear again, to diminish existing individual rights or the rights of the representative associations. In the case of an individual, nothing in this legislation will, for example, prevent a private citizen, as I've said, speaking at a local primary school meeting, simply because they happen to be a Defence Force member, provided that they're not in uniform or otherwise make themselves identifiable as a member of the Defence Forces. That is currently the case, and there's no change in that policy. So we're setting out these principles in primary legislation for clarity. And I've consistently said also throughout the debate on this bill that these provisions fully reflect both legal advice and strong advice provided on the matter by military management as well. So I have received advice from military management in respect of this. And I think all of you agree on the importance of a visibly apolitical defence forces and the perception of that to this day. We can't minimise that, particularly in the current geopolitical environment where penetration, it's a much different world to the world maybe of 2 or 3 decades ago. The simple fact is that the provisions set out in Section 24 of the bill in relation to associate membership of ICTU by our Defence Force representative associations, I think is a very welcome and positive development. That's the context there. This is providing for association with ICTU. And I think it's a welcome and positive development. For the first time, there will be a mechanism in place to enable the Permanent Defence Force representative associations to avail of associate membership of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And I think that's the context in which these provisions should be remembered. And in addition, I've reflected on this a lot in between different stages of the passage of this bill. I do believe they're necessary. I believe they're proportionate. In terms of the language, I think a government policy is definable. Political matter. I'm not so sure of political controversy, because one person's mundane political matter is another person's political controversy. So not clear how that would add clarity to it. And just on the, people did listen to Deputy McDowell about the issue about independent and that it was noted, and I'm informed about that it's been reflected upon. The text, they believe, political organisation, that term covers and would be commonly interpreted as including more than traditional political parties. I mean, independents have organisations, political organisations as well, their own if necessary. That you could define, and increasingly, I know that could be a passing phase, but increasingly independents are tending to band together as independents as well. But that's not the point you're making. You can have an independent, but that independent invariably has an organisation. So look, it's a legal definitional point, but I think that we're satisfied that it's covered by the language. So in summary, the key lines are while in uniform or making himself or herself identifiable, and maintaining the primacy of an apolitical defence force. And then it's in the context of facilitating membership of ICTU on an association basis by PD4 and by RACO. And I think that's a good day's work. Progress.
Senator Craughwell and then McDowell.
You said it yourself. While in uniform or otherwise making himself or herself identifiable as a member of the Permanent Defence Forces. The Secretary-General of RACO, the Deputy Secretary-General, any member of RACO Executive Committee, any member of PD4's Executive Committee, any official working for PD4 is a member of the Permanent Defence Forces on secondment to the representative body. Therefore, in your view, if they speak out, you're facilitating them today. You're saying that's perfectly all right, that's their job, that's what they're entitled to do. Who knows who the next Minister for Defence will be and might take an entirely different view, because there is in this a gagging order that can be implemented if they wanted to do that. I cannot see a way that you can get away from
Paragraph
this.
G of Section 2A, that the provisions on the making of public statements or comments are without prejudice to the purpose of an association of representing members. Sorry? Section 2A of the Defence Amendment Act. So in other words, we've clarified that. I went back to the Attorney General prior to going into the House, the other House. Nothing can prevent the members that you identify there, members of RACO, members of PD4, for speaking on behalf of their members.
That's Section G, is it?
I have no issue with that, by the way. Yeah, paragraph G of the proposed new Section 2A.
Yeah, we have an amendment coming to that later on anyway. Thank you. Taoiseach, as far as I'm concerned, all we need to do here is to remove the on matters of government policy. If we remove that, I think we can agree to move forward on that. And again, I go back to the situation, and you didn't actually address it. A pride parade is a political parade. Would you agree with that? And if it is, then any regulation coming forward has to cover such incidents where the Defence Forces would be allowed to parade in uniform, proudly parade in uniform. And it was really disappointing for me last weekend when they were told they weren't welcome at a pride parade. There are many members of the Defence Forces who are right across the community. They cover everything. And it is great that we have moved to a community where, for example, homosexuality is accepted in the Defence Forces. In my time, it was illegal. But you're talking about being identified in uniform. That's one aspect that has to be resolved, and we have to have an answer to that. But after that, if we can just get rid of the matters of government policy from this piece of legislation, I think we can move on and get to the next part of this bill. I think it's important to get rid of that.
Look, that is the fundamental point that has just been made. I think it was Kevin Higgins said it in 1924, if that was the year, when he said those who take to pay wear the uniform of the state must serve the state. And it stood us in good stead. And you know, I have the best interest of the Defence Force members. I think we've done a lot in the last year and a half and before that in terms of improving matters across the board. In many ways, I believe this is a protection to members of the Defence Forces as well. It gives them clarity. But to answer the question Senator Wilson asked and others, you can be a member of, there's no bar or prohibition of being a member of a community grouping. The only issue here is while in uniform or making oneself, making oneself identifiable. So putting the hand...
You're identifying as a member of the Defence
Outside the room, you put your hand up and you start saying, I'm a member of the Defence Force and I believe in X, Y and Z. I mean, government policy, let's look at it, let's turn it around. Are we really saying that we're inviting members of the Defence Forces to be criticising government policy publicly, left, right and centre? Well, if you don't have a provision like this in, that's what's going to happen. And there are plenty of people out there who would love to infiltrate and create mischief too. Like we had a different case recently in respect of Libya, where there was penetration. Not by a political grouping, but in terms of former members. But some in a grey area between leave out in Libya. So we have to be wide awake as well as to what can happen. And I have to be absolutely clear, there is no attempt in any shape or form to restrict the work of the representative associations in advocacy for their members. None. And I find that difficult to comprehend that that's now been asserted, given that this is actually to move it forward and give association membership with ICTU. That's the whole purpose of this. And this all had been agreed, by the way, in the litigation that gave rise to this, in the association issue with ICTU. A lot of this was hammered out in an agreement with the representative bodies at that time. I think it's legitimate for people to ask the questions, of course, and to get clarity and get guarantees. But this is no way designed, and it doesn't have the legal effect of in any way restricting the representative associations from advocacy, arguing on behalf of their members, which I welcome and I have no issue with. And I meet with RACUP regularly and with PD Fora in respect of a wide range of issues. We've just recently signed off on the Organisation Working Time Directive, which we finalised the military management position. We had talks, we got that signed off. It's over with the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment now for that department who have responsibility for that act to legislate. So, we're not trying to bring in legislation that would somehow restrict any of that. And I'm very, very clear about that. The Pride Parade, I don't see Pride Parade as political. But you might argue that it is, but I think, and in many ways, but the positivity of all of that was diversity, and you put it very eloquently yourself in terms of the changes that have occurred in terms of diversity within our defence forces. And yeah, I think I would regret also that they were not facilitated to reflect that diversity, because the vast majority of our defence forces have no truck with those who engage in serious assaults on people. They value what they stand for. And when I say, I don't mean higher standard. What I mean by that is, if you're a Garda and defence, people do look up. We all looked up to the Garda and the military. Maybe that's kind of a very naive way of looking at things, but we kind of did. It mattered in terms of the sense of order in society. And we take pride in how our defence forces perform overseas. Top-class military. And the fact that the Chief of Staff was selected, by his peers to be the Chief of the EU Military Committee, I think speaks volumes for the quality of the military leadership in terms of capacity and understanding of complex military issues, strategy, and so on like that. So I want to enhance all of that. I actually think allowing for political sort of, and it could get very, very political very, very quickly, depending on who's in government or who's not in government and so on like that. And I would hate to think that we'd end up in that scenario.
Senator Craughwell.
Thank you. Minister, firstly, I want to thank you for putting on the record of this House that the vast majority of members of the Defence Forces are decent, honest, hard-working, law-abiding citizens, and I think that was a really important statement to make in this House today, because the level of hurt there is out in the defence community and defence family over things that have been said in recent days, you have now corrected the record, and I thank you for that. To get back to our matters of government policy, that's all I'm asking you to remove. I think it's a simple thing to ask. Do remember, when we're talking about representative bodies, PD4 and RACO, they are serving members of the Defence Forces. If the Chief of Staff or a senior officer within the Defence Forces feels they have transgressed in some way or other, they are subject to military discipline. They can be paraded and they can be charged with a military offence. And from that point of view, they are unique in how they should be treated within this legislation. And my colleague Senator McDougall draws the example of a member of the Defence Forces who may not agree with their representative body. But I take it the representative bodies have been elected by their members, their executive has been elected by their members, and I think the restriction on discussion of matters of government policies, to remove that, I think that is perfectly reasonable question to ask. And it's all that's been asked in this section, just to remove that.
Margaret. And
Sorry, to remove government policy. We are saying that's without prejudice to the representative associations' ability, capacity to advocate on behalf of their members' interests, which is quite a broad range in terms of housing. It does. They do advocate on behalf of housing. So it doesn't in any way. I mean, they're established for a function to represent their members. So the representational nature and function of the representative bodies is in no way stymied or undermined by this Act or by any provision in this Act. And we've actually the putting in of without prejudice is to make that legally crystal clear. And the Attorney General office and the Attorney General is absolutely clear about that. No, I think otherwise you could have, for example, and that's true, and let's be careful of the areas, but think of Middle East or think of, if suddenly PD4 record began to comment on that could have consequences for our people in the region. So it gets very, once you start opening that door, well, where does it begin and where does it end? But I think I would be with you. I'm absolutely clear. I want to preserve their rights. I want to add to them insofar as they will know from now on be able to take part in national pay agreements themselves. They'll be at the table, whereas before they weren't. That's what this bill does. Essentially, that's the real practical de facto outcome of the bill.
If I can go back to my time as President of the Teachers' Union of Ireland, I remember making a statement one day, and at the following executive meeting, one of the executive members put up his hand and he said, "President, who gave you permission to make the bloody statement? There's an executive committee here, and the executive committee decides what you can and cannot say." We have an additional restriction on the representative body of the Defence Forces because of this section. That would not apply to any other representative body. They would be answerable to their executive and their membership and nobody else. We have, the nuance here is that you get the wrong minister in place. You get the wrong Chief of Staff in place, and a statement made by one of the representative bodies, get yourself in here and explain yourself, because you have made a statement and you're a recognised member of the Defence Forces. And I fully accept what you're saying about without prejudice, and I go back to the same thing. Remove our matters of government policy, and I think we can move on from this. And I think it's a simple enough request.
I think the essential point is, and I would agree with largely what I think the issue is members seek legal guarantee in terms of the representative function of the representative associations. That's secure, and it is. I made sure of it. I went back to check it myself, and the Attorney General is clear that that is achieved in the without prejudice section, and that is very, very clear.
I'm a little concerned. We're running very tight on time, and there's a huge section of this bill that deals with the external oversight body and the participation of the Secretariat. I wonder if there's a way that we can extend time today, that we could call the Leader to the House to extend time, give us another half an hour.
As you know, it's not my gift, but if the acting leader wants to speak to the government leader about extending time, that's a matter for the Leader of the House. I can't do that. As you know, the order of the House has been set by the House today in the order of business and agreed. But if someone wants to talk to the Leader, and if the Minister is available, that's a matter for the government side to work out on.
Thank you. I move the amendments. I want to deal with them, with all of the amendments together, if I may, given the time that we have. In 323.1 on page 14, the Secretary-General of the Department of Defence shall be an ex officio member of the external oversight body. And on page 15 in subsection 7, the person appointed or designated under subsection 6 as chairperson of the external oversight body shall not have served in the Defence Forces or any other defence force. I find both of those things repugnant to the external oversight body. First and foremost, let's deal with the Secretary-General of the Department. During the debate at the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence, the chairman of the external oversight body, when asked, admitted that there was a possibility from time to time that the Secretary-General would have to recuse herself from a meeting because there would be a conflict of interest. Now, at the end of the day, Taoiseach, it is extremely important. We're talking about an external oversight body that is to change the culture of the Defence Force, and we're hearing lots of background noises about resistance, etc., etc. And what I want is, I want the report that comes from that external oversight body to you and will be laid before this House, that everybody in this House and outside and members of the Defence Forces will have confidence that the external oversight body was not just said to be independent, but was seen to be independent. And being seen to be independent is extremely important. The Secretary-General has had a role in drafting terms and conditions, terms of reference for the external oversight body. The Secretary-General is, if you want, the employer of the external oversight body for the department, and the report will go to the Secretary-General and you when it's complete. It is wrong in every way for the Secretary-General to be an ex officio member of the oversight body. I would argue that if she has to be, then the representative bodies also have to be. But I would prefer that the representative bodies were also excluded from the external oversight body. I would want that body to be 100% beyond question with respect to its independence. If I can be so bold as to say, if there were a problem in Fianna Fáil in the morning and you wanted somebody to come in and have a look, say there was allegations of bullying or something like that, and you wanted somebody to come in and examine it, you would not want any member of the party or any member of the party staff party to the oversight or the examination. You want it independent. And I think, Taoiseach, you know exactly where I'm coming from. Every member of this House that spoke at stage 2, I wasn't here unfortunately, I was in Tallinn with a group on cyber security, but I watched the debate. And every member of this House, irrespective of party, spoke and said it would be wrong for the SecGen to be a member of that body. In the Joint Oireachtas Committee, everybody said the same thing, and in the Dáil. Surely to God, at this stage, the penny should have dropped. Get the external oversight body, an independent body with a fine chair, an excellent chair, and excellent members. The members that you've chosen are excellent. There is one bogey in the pile, and that bogey must be removed. I leave it because I'm sure other members need to.
Yeah, first of all, I thank the senators for raising this issue. And the first point I would make is, what's the context here? Why the recommendation for an external oversight body? And its genesis is in the independent review group. The independent review group not just recommended the establishment of such an external body, but also that the Secretary General would be a member of it. When I was in the other house debating this, and prior to the publication of the independent review group report, almost every person in that house representing different parties in advance were saying, will you accept all the recommendations, Minister? Please give me a commitment now, Minister, that you'll accept all of the recommendations. Or are you going to welch and do this? Now, I met with the independent review group. And I met with the chair, with Judge O'Hanlon, and I met with other members, about 6 or 7 members. And what they said in terms of their experience of being on that review group was not good. In terms of the members of the Defence Forces that they had met, who said misogyny was rife, who said the complaints process was inadequate, and that if you made a complaint, it was a career-ending move or a career-limiting move. Now, people made, and I know, Senator Craughwell, you made an impassioned contribution to this House at the time of the debate on the independent review group recommendations, but and maybe suggested that and I would stress, I accept the point that these were not findings of fact because it wasn't a statutory-based tribunal, but it did make conclusions, and they were far-reaching conclusions, but they were in relation to the Defence Forces, not the Department of Defence. So the independent review was examining how was the Department of Defence coping or managing complaints, assaults, right across the whole gamut of human behaviour. And what emerged was not a pretty sight at the time, and there has been huge efforts made to try and move into a new journey of cultural transformation, and the external oversight body is part of that. And that's an important point, that this was an independent review group specifically on the Defence Forces. And I see a logic, and I've been in government at different times, in terms of operationally and having impact and having effect of a Secretary General being an ex officio member. But what really is behind this too, and I think to a certain extent Senator Craughwell probably alluded to it earlier in a different context, and I've witnessed this now, to be frank, that like RACO and PD4 would say we should be on it, because some people want to turn this from being an oversight body into a representative body. Now, to be fair to you, you have said there that you ideally don't want that, but others have argued and advocated for that. And the argument being from the IRG, when I met them, they said to me, previous attempts at change have failed, and have failed abysmally. That's the context. The IMG processes, they said, were ineffective in bringing about the change that was required. Because, you know, Senator Clune and others will say, you know, that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, assertions and allegations were made that weren't really followed through in terms of getting change. And the issue here is we do have to get change. And I think there is a degree of resistance to change. And at one level, it's all focused in on the role of a Secretary General. I'm not convinced that that is as major an issue as it's been presented. I think the bigger issue is that sort of equivalence issue between military and Department of Defence. I think that's what kind of underpins some of the representations and advocacy that has been made. And I think we need to move beyond that. I genuinely mean that generally across the board. And again, there are many people in the organisation who want to drive forward with change, but I think there's also resistance to change. And also, in some elements, there wasn't the full acceptance of the conclusions of the IRG group. And I've seen this in practice, where if I, for example, in the strategic framework, and I hear this, why is he going on all the time about cultural transformation? Do you really have to say that in every speech? Well, I do have to say that in every speech, because I am certain that we need to change the culture. And I've spoken to members of the Defence Forces themselves, and at the moment, they don't believe that it's going to happen. And the two reports of the external oversight body has not pulled its punches and is saying that culture change, people on the ground don't believe it's happening at a sufficient level as we speak right now. And that's the real issue here. Not whether the SecGen is on it or not on it. The real issue is the capacity of this external oversight body to really bring about change, and we need to bring it about. Status quo will not suffice. The old way of doing things will not suffice in terms of really making sure that this is a safe environment for people to work with dignity, that they can make complaints, that won't be a career-limiting move, and that we can modernise and so on. I think the vast majority want to go in that direction. And I spoke to members through various networks directly, and they're sceptical. You know, they are sceptical of whether change will happen, because previous iterations of independent monitoring groups and so on just did not work. And I think if there's anything approaching a representational sort of composition of an external oversight body, it will not work, in my view. This has to work, because we are at a critical juncture. And if you were to ask my question, we've dealt with a lot of pay issues. We've dealt with the health eligibility. So every member of the enlisted forces now has entitlement to private care. We've done the patrol duty allowance. Starting pay is up there, higher than most starting rates for public service. I think the real issue is culture, command and control, induction, training. What's the initial experiences of people when they come through? These are all issues we've got to work on. What's the progression for women in the Defence Forces? I mean, up to the IRG report and before, if a woman could not attend a course because of pregnancy or maternity or whatever, they were down the pecking order in terms of promotion. So these are really fundamental issues that we have to change. And if you look at the upper echelons, the number of women at upper echelons is quite low because of, and women have said this to me who have worked in the Defence Forces. And I believe the Chief of Staff is committed to this. As well. But a culture doesn't, I equally acknowledge, doesn't happen overnight either, particularly in an organisation, an institution like the Defence Forces. I've received 2 reports so far from the external oversight body. I appreciate what has been said in terms of the quality of the people that have been appointed, and I think that's important. I think the chair is well established and has good bona fides, and people like Julie Cinnamon and indeed others. And the member of the Miss Sam Deforge, for example, who's Director of Conduct, Equity and Justice in the UK Ministry of Defence, she's proved to be very valuable so far. So that external representation and her expertise and experiences is proved to be very helpful. And I have no issue with adding to the reservoir of that international expertise if we can find people willing to serve. And it doesn't require legislative provision to do that. And I take the spirit of Senator Malcolm Byrne's amendment in that regard. I haven't, compromised on the IRG's recommendations. I've accepted them in full. I know members will say to me, well, you don't have to. You could vary them. But I think there is strength in accepting them. And it's a bit unusual. Sometimes you get an inquiries report and you just get the report. But I actually met with the judge and members of that group. And it was a difficult and challenging experience, because all of them, to a person, were clear that they were a bit taken back, to put it lightly, in terms of the stories they were told. And that's, we can't, I know that it's a year ago, we've now established a tribunal of inquiry. That will determine, hopefully, bring more clarity and transparency to it, to the issues, and whether they're findings of fact or conclusions. So I was taken by that oral presentation by the representatives of the groups. And their view was that this body, as they recommended, was the most effective mechanism to bring about the change that undoubtedly is required.
Thank you, Senator Craughwell, and then Senator Wilson.
And thank you.
And then Senator Wall.
Taoiseach, it's no secret that I despise the way the IRG report was published. It would have been significant enough at the time to put out 2 lines that said there's prima facie evidence based on our research that would require a tribunal of inquiry. The rush to the gallows in this building with rope to hang everybody that wore a uniform was absolutely outrageous and disgusting. But that's not the issue today. The issue today is we are where we are. You have put a tribunal in place, and for that I thank you. Culture change, I have no difficulty with what you're saying with respect to culture change. I am saying to you today, the external oversight body, the members of that body that you have picked are good. Patricia King, long time dealing with employment. The chairman himself, an excellent chairman. I have no difficulty with any of that. I want the Defence Force members that I meet to be proud of the fact that in the end, the report of that body will lead to the culture change. You say it, the Chief of Staff says, the IRG report says, RACO says, PD4 said needs to happen. I want to see it to happen. I want to see that report accepted by everybody. It's not about the Secretary-General as a person, it's about the appointment of Secretary-General being a member of that board. I accept the IRG recommended that the Sec-Gen would be on the external oversight body. But everybody in this House has told you it is wrong in every sense of the word to have a Secretary-General from the Department of Defence. Put another Secretary-General on it if you want to do that. But the Department of Defence should be one step removed from that body. And at the end of the day, we all want to have confidence in it, so we do. You have an excellent team put together. RACO do not want to be a part of it, but if the Sec-Gen is a part of it, then they should be a part of it. That's my position. And the same would apply to PD4. I gave evidence to the IRG, and a number of other people gave evidence to the IRG. It had nothing to do with bullying. It had nothing to do with sexual harassment or anything else. It was about respect for serving members who had been forgotten, like Billy Cadian, like the Jadaville lads, like the men from Nyemba. The Chief of Staff is putting that right now, and it's time that it was put right. For God's sake, I'm asking you, pull back from this now. And if you don't pull back from it, I'm asking the Sec-General herself to actually recuse herself from it. This external oversight body has to have the confidence of everybody. It does not have the confidence of this House or the lower house, while the Secretary-General is an ex officio member. So if you can't take the decision, then I would ask the Sec-General herself to take the decision. I want this to work, and I want nobody to be able to turn around here in a year or 2 years' time and say, actually the whole thing was rigged because the Sec-Gen was a member of the oversight body. Let's do it right.
This was, the recommendation was an external oversight body into the Defence Forces, not the Department, arising out of testimonies and the work of the Independent Review Group. And the evidence is conclusive that previous iterations of independent monitoring groups and so on, which had a representative sort of, did not work. Everyone looks after their particular agenda. And I'll say one thing, I'm 18 months in this position. I mean, we've just had recent developments and people have different perspectives on it. There needs to be change here. I'm determined to bring about change. And I can tell you, it's amongst the rank and file of the members of the Defence Forces who currently don't believe there'll be change if the status quo prevails. And the biggest task we have is to convince membership that change is going to happen and their voice is going to be listened to. I agree with your point about the voice. In fact, the EOB went down to various barracks, spoke to the rank and file. And what upset them, well, not upset them, but what their big takeaway was, the rank and file don't see change happening fast enough, and they're concerned that it will happen to a sufficient degree at all. So the EOB is there to make sure that once and for all, we will bring about change in terms of how the Defence Forces operate and work. We have big challenges in terms of recruitment and retention. I do believe material that emerged through the IRG group is a factor in that recruitment, and above all, in retention. In retention, because a number of cases that are coming through, or that did come through, all point to a dysfunctional complaints system, a dysfunctional sort of way that people can have their voice heard. And we do need to change it. And I find the EOB quite helpful already in terms of, if I could say, in terms of an interim complaints process, which is now underway, you know. So as a minister, I'm absolutely determined to put the foundations in. And I don't want people to say back in 5 years, we lost the moment. And there's a moment now to bring about this change. Sorry.
I would ask Senator Craughwell